Okay, I think we're okay now. Okay, great. Okay, so what's the big difference between the stuff on the left and the stuff on the right?
I think usually when you measure the things on the right, if they would stay the same if the people that I don't know where I'm going with this. If the researcher took the measurement of someone's height and someone else came and took their height, that would be the same. They would have a constant tool for measuring, and something like quality of teaching could vary for the individual depending on maybe not quality motivation, for example, could vary from one researcher to another's the subject.
I think that's the complete answer, Connie. Thank you very much. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the big thing here is that all of these factors on the right have fixed units, fixed methods of how you measure height, weight, temperature, volume, speed. I mean, these are just examples. How you measure educational attainment? I could say educational attainment is how well you've performed in your courses. Connie might say, well, it's how many years you've spent after school obtaining an education. Samantha might say, hey, educational attainment is how many different types, what's the diversity you have in your education. And when you think about it, you can assume that different sociologists will have different arguments to allow for different units. Hi, Aretha. Different units for all of these social social science-based measurements. So that's the big difference. Oftentimes, you'll have two experts in the social sciences who describe the same concept with entirely different variables and entirely different measures for those variables. So the question is, if there's going to be so much disagreement between two researchers in the social sciences, why should we bother having variables? Because the variables are going to differ. So if I do a research project based on, let's say, educational attainment, and then Marianne decides to do something on educational attainment, and we're talking about entirely different things, why should we even bother with variables? Because clearly the variables won't agree. So why bother?
Is it because we're getting two different perspectives?
Uh, well, the two different perspectives cause disagreement, right? Because
Yeah.
they are different. So do we need the disagreement? Why is it still necessary to find variables? Because you're going to have two different researchers have different variables. One of the big reasons to still find variables is it focuses data collection. For example, marital satisfaction. You can have different variables for that. The two researchers might disagree. One researcher might say marital satisfaction is based on combined disposable income because it leads to being able to buy different things to satisfy yourself. Another researcher may say, well, it's the degree of intimacy or the number of intimate interactions they have per month. A third person might say it's the amount of time they spend in each other's company and they enjoy each other's company over a week or whatever it is. But the point is, what one researcher will typically pick one method. Or maybe a couple methods at most. So what it does for that researcher is it focuses their data collection. Okay, so let's think about this example. Attention in classroom for a child. Okay, we spoke about that last class. And we had different examples. One person said, well, looking at the board or at the teacher. The opposite of obviously attention is playing with hair, fidgeting, looking away, scribbling. I don't know if what all we covered, but these are different examples of children either having attention in class or being distracted in class. Now, it might be easier for a researcher to pick 2 or 3 different factors instead of picking everything. I have a message on my screen. My internet connection is unstable, so please do not panic. I don't know why we occasionally have this. It is a Laurentian problem. I've sent them an email about this. I haven't heard back. But if it sounds like I'm getting disconnected, don't worry about it. Everything is getting recorded, so you can always go back and see. I think it's okay now. Anyway, so it's easier for a researcher to say, pick a couple of different things as signs of lack of attention and record that for a class of, say, 30 children, instead of looking for every one of these. Okay, so in that sense, the observer's attention is focused to just a couple of different things. So it really focuses that data collection. So they're looking for very specific things. So that's why it's necessary, even though the variables may change from one researcher to another in the social sciences, you should still be collecting data. You should still be having variables. Sorry, just a second. Okay, there we go. The other reason why you should collect data why you should have variables in the social sciences is it makes your research streamlined and efficient. If you're consistently collecting data on children that are fidgeting in class, that's easy. You can just look for that one behavior. Even if you're looking at 30 students, fidget, no fidget, easy, right? Or plays with hair, doesn't play with hair, easy. Looks down at their work, doesn't look down at their work, easy. So you're collecting easy and quick data. If you can think of a classroom where there are 30 kids, one kid's playing with their hair, one kid is fidgeting, one kid is playing with the button on their t-shirt, one kid is turning around throwing a ball, and you're trying to record all of these observations at the same time and correlate it to the student that's doing them, do you think that's going to happen realistically?
Too much.
It's too much, right? So we recognize that all of them are variables for distraction, but we can't do all of them. Right? So if you may have 2 researchers recording a couple of that information, you may have 2, and they may have different variables, but still, because their own definition of what is distracted behavior and their own variables allow them to focus and streamline the data, and it makes their research more efficient. It also allows for consistent observations, because if you have defined distraction as playing with your shirt button or playing with your hair, or maybe a combination of both, and not the entire 10 things on the list, then at least every time you measure distraction between 2 different classrooms, 3 different classrooms, maybe the same classroom on different days of the week, you're going to consistently measure against the same variable. So when you say, well, distractions were lower on Tuesday than on Monday, you've still compared apples to apples. You've not compared apples to oranges, right? And that is important. It also creates a context in which to talk about, in this case, we're talking about distractions, but it could be anything. It could be if you're measuring responsive behaviors. So as most of you know, responsive behaviors, there are plenty of behaviors called responsive behaviors. Now, if you're accounting for responsive behaviors and if you're observing one client at a time, you may be able to account for all different responsive behaviors. But if you're looking for responsive behaviors in the cafeteria where there are 30 residents at one time in an advanced stage of dementia or cognitive decline, now you're faced with a challenge. There could be, out of the 30, you could have 20 responsive behaviors occurring every couple of seconds. You're not going to pick up on that. So you're going to have to streamline that. And then you have to create a context to say, well, we observed for these responsive behaviors, we had the option of A, B, C, D, and D responsive behaviors, but we chose to pick A and B because these seem to be the most prominent and most observable and allowed consistency between observations. So it allows for a creation of context. And for example, you can say, nutritional, the role of nutrition or the role of good sleep and responsive behaviors in long-term care. So, okay. So the next question is, how do we measure data that we collect? Okay, and especially in the social sciences, how do we collect our data? And there are three, well, I would say four now, but primarily there are three ways that you collect data in the social sciences. In the hard sciences, what you do in the natural sciences is you have instruments, you use those instruments, but these methods tend to be common even for the natural sciences. One is observation. You sit down and in a cafeteria, in a long-term care, which is supporting older adults, a lot of residents have significant amount of mental health challenges, and you're observing for behaviors. You can observe, okay? You can collect. You can have a data sheet. You have a data sheet. You're looking for responsive behaviors. You have defined responsive behaviors as what do you want to give me examples of responsive behaviors that you might expect to observe in the cafeteria?
Punching.
Okay, punching. Is that common?
If they're experiencing they didn't have enough sleep last night, or they didn't really want to get up, they're resistant to something happening, then they will act out.
Yeah.
Punching can happen.
How about sleeping?
How about
falling asleep?
Falling asleep. Is that considered a responsive behavior?
Well, that's an unresponsive behavior, but they won't eat while they're falling asleep.
Right. No, but if you had to, like, for example, if you're collecting research data, I'm not going to put it in responsive behaviors, but it can be a behavior itself.
Yeah.
Yelling.
So I'm going to scratch out verbal. I'm going to say yelling, swearing,
Mm-hmm.
and it fits all of that. So we will say
throwing things, forks, knives, cups. Those who are mobile enough with the motor skills are well enough.
Right, throwing stuff for people who can do it. So when you're observing all of these things, even if you aren't taking names, what you can do is, as you're observing, you can start to make a checklist. Okay, one punching incident occurred here. We had a couple shoving. Well, there's a lot of yelling. So 5 incidents of yelling within your 30-day window. You had 1 incidence of throwing stuff. And let's say this was Monday. You go on a Tuesday, same thing. You go on Wednesday, so on. So you have a little data sheet for every day of the week, and you're collecting observations and responsive behavior. And this might be a very simple data sheet. You may not be specifying by resident. You may just be looking at overall behaviors. Perhaps this is in response to a new program that says, well, let's play gentle classical music all the time in all the hallways, and let's see if we see a decline in behaviors and so on. So you can collect a lot of data by observation, okay? A lot of research is done through observation because it's considered the least intrusive. There are 2 kinds of observation. One kind of observation is called participant observation. Another kind of observation is called non-participant observation. The way participant observation works is that you are an observer, but you're participating in the observation that you're also making. So there's a benefit to participant observation. So an example of a participant observation would be, for example, what does it feel to attend a class administered through Zoom from Laurentian University. So you could be enrolled as a student, participating and observing what are the difficulties we have. Well, sometimes there's a unstable internet connection. Sometimes the professor forgets to record the lectures. The students are able to interact. We don't necessarily, we see some students and we don't see the students in class. So there is some feeling of a classroom. So these would be your own observations while being a student. You're participating, you're recognizing your own observations, you're recognizing the observations that you have of the classroom. So you can collect a lot of data through participant observation. So when you do participant observation, typically what happens is, I'm just going to erase everything. So in participant observation, when you make your observation data sheet, no matter what observation you have to do, you have to define what you're going to observe. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, when this course was, we weren't able to do the course by Zoom or anything. It was a full on-campus course. So one of the exercises I'd have students do is we would go down to the Tim Hortons. Sorry, Madison, did you have a question? Okay. Not hearing anything from Madison, I'll proceed. So what we'd do is we'd go down to the local Tim Hortons and we'd have about 6 or 7 students, and I would tell the students, I'd give them 10 minutes, I'd just say, well, observe what's going on in the Tim Hortons. And what happens in that situation is now there's when you just don't know what you're observing, if you have different people with visual impairment around an elephant and you ask each of them to describe what an elephant is, one person will say, well, this is like a tree. An elephant is like a tree. Another person would say, well, the elephant is like a rope. The third person would say, well, this feels like a big flat surface. I can't really tell anything about the elephant, right? So when we had all the students describe what they saw at Tim Hortons, everybody observed different things. One student said, I couldn't notice, but the person making the bagels didn't have gloves on. Then the second person said, did you see the guy at the far end picking up the muffins? He had serious jailhouse tats. I'm like, okay, great. How do you know? Anyway, the third student picked up on, what did they pick up on? I can't remember. So the point was everyone was observing very, very different things. And the reason is this exercise was done on purpose. It was to indicate that if you don't know what you're looking for, you yourself will look for different things. So even when you're observing for stuff, for example, if you're observing for responsive behavior, it's good to define what that responsive behavior is that you're looking for, or at least have a list of them, right? So it's not like a bunch of visually impaired people around an elephant trying to describe what it is. One person thinks it's a tree trunk, one person thinks it's a rope, one person thinks it's a nice loofy brush because they have the end of the tail, one person thinks it's a vacuum cleaner because they have the end of the trunk, and so on, okay? So even when you make an observation table, you really have to describe or define what you're looking for. It can be a list. It doesn't have to be, it can be a short list. And then, of course, you start to write down your observations, right? So, if it is quantitative, you start to write a list of what your different behaviors you're looking for, and then you start to jot down how many numbers you have. So behaviors and numbers of behaviors and your own opinions. That's important when you are an observer. You write down what occurred. For example, if you're in a long-term care facility, somebody shoved somebody. So you say shoving occurred once, but then you have an opinion because you saw the person who did the shoving. So he seemed really upset. You might have a different older adult who shoves and goes, hey, 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 because, they think it's a joke. right? That could happen too. So that might be part of your personal opinion regarding those observations. It's good to pay attention to that, and especially in qualitative work, because there's a context lent to the act that's happening, okay? Um, However, you can do the same thing when you're a participant. You can't be a participant in a long-term care if you're a younger person, because they will not admit you as a resident. But you can look at behaviors, say at a rock concert, where you can be a participant. You can 100% be a participant observer at a rock concert, because I don't think there's an age barrier that prevents you from getting in. So you're looking for different behaviors. You're looking for use of drugs. You're looking for consumption of alcohol. You're looking for rowdy behavior. You're looking for, you know, I don't know. I can't think of all the behaviors. I've never been to a rock concert. I don't know. I just listen to all my music on the radio or whatever. Anyway, so again, even when you're a participant, you can talk about the behavior. Let's say drug use. You can talk about it. You can talk about how you felt about the whole situation. And this is how you collect observations, whether it's objective or somewhat subjective, whether it's descriptive, and so on. Non-participant observation, the example is when you're in the cafeteria watching older adults. You're not a participant, you're looking at it. So there is a big difference between participant observation and non-participant observation. And think about what it means when you're collecting data, when you're a participant versus non-participant. What is the biggest thing that you gain or lose in one way or the other?
When you're observing data?
You're observing in both situations, right?
Okay.
You're observing. In one situation, you are not participating, which means you're at a long-term care facility, you're observing, you're not being part of it, right?
Okay.
And
as a participant, I guess I'm kind of able to channel the variables, because I can ask questions that would narrow to the kind of response I may want, or to the topic.
You can't ask questions as a participant. You're participating. You're not interviewing people.
So, because I was thinking that the non-participant person, well, they would just be observing like all over, and that their observations may not be as defined, because they're not, looking for a particular set of, I don't know, things.
So well, they're not looking for everything, and you're not experiencing everything. So social scientists would generally argue that non-participant data is less sensitive, because you, as a researcher, you're not in tune with the data quite as much as participant observation. So in order to truly understand what it feels like to be at a rock concert, I have two options. I can buy a ticket, go enjoy the rock concert, and experience all of those things while being mindful and writing down what I observe, or even doing it slightly after the fact, okay? Or I can watch the whole thing in a very aloof manner, say using video recordings of the whole process, and it becomes non-participant. Now, the richness of the experience and of the data that comes out of me being a participant obviously is far greater, right? And of course, the negative side to that is many researchers will argue, well, it's actually very, very hard as a participant observer to be very objective in your observations, because you're being influenced by the whole thing. You're at a rock concert. You are trying to observe and be objective as much as you can, but you're also trying to experience everything. Maybe you decide to try some drugs because you want to see what that part of the rock concert is like. Maybe you want to go be a little rowdy. Maybe, so all of a sudden you're engaging in all of these things to get the participant experience, okay, while trying to remain objective all at the same time. So there's a challenge with that, and scientists who are in favor of Non-participant observation will always argue that there is this challenge with participant observation, and it's the reverse for participant researchers will always argue that it's far more sensitive and far more applicable. Okay. So observation is a very important way in which a lot of research in social sciences is done. There's a lot of observation. One of the things that you all have to remember is, despite the fact that you can actually observe passively, there are ethical implications of collecting any kind of data, including observation data. Can you think of what the ethical implications are when you collect observational data?
You have to keep their privacy. You can't share with other people particular details about the person that would reveal who it is.
If you're observing, you may not ever talk to the person unless you know them directly, right? Yes, if you already had access to the data, so hypothetically, if I was observing the students in my classroom for different behaviors while they were in class in my course, I know all of their identities. Okay.
Could it be that the information must be used responsibly?
Well, there is that.
Would you need consent?
Yes, thank you. And that's the important part, consent.
Even as if you're just observing.
So here is how most ethical bodies will look at you collecting information through observation. If you're collecting information through observation in a place where there is no expectation of privacy, example, rock concert. Nobody at a rock concert is expecting to not be seen. There is no expectation of privacy. Observation at the beach. Observation at the mall. There is no expectation of privacy. In such situations, you do not need ethical approval from a research governing body at your university or a larger institution, simply because there is no expectation of privacy in those situations. The opposite applies when you're seeking to observe people in, let's say, long-term care. Then you have to get approval because it is observation, and if you don't know the residents, you have no personal information. You still have to get, even though that's the case, you still have to get approval from the the administrators. Now, if you happen to know some people in the long-term care facility, then you have to get approval from the individuals themselves or their families.
That's the same for anything you're doing that requires a photo to take a picture of them.
Yes, and it's the same. It's protection of privacy, and that's what it's all about, right?
So, what about a situation where you would be taking down data on traffic violations? You wouldn't know the people, and they would just be data. So you wouldn't need to get their approval because you couldn't stop everyone and say,
Yes, traffic violations, you don't need ethical approval. For example, if you're looking at red light breakers around Christmas season because people tend to drive badly, this is an example straight out of your textbook. You're simply counting the number of cars that broke traffic lights. Unless you were very meticulous to write down each person's license plate and what they did, which would be a bit of a problem. So typically what happens is when you are doing a research, when you're doing a research project through the university, whether your project needs ethics approval or not, you would send the project to the ethics board, because the moment they look at your methodology, they can determine whether you are collecting confidential information or not. Okay, so the moment you tell your ethics board, we're just counting the numbers of cars that break red light. Your ethics board is going to look at it and go, yeah, well, they're not really writing down anybody's information. They're not describing the person in the car that broke the light. Doesn't matter, go for it. But if you were interested in identifying which plates were frequently involved, hypothetically, you had so many people at so many lights that you could probably write down license plates of everybody who broke the thing, and you could kind of narrow it down to a certain set of license plates who are frequent offenders. That might be a problem. Your ethics body would come in and say, well, you know, that could be seen as an identifier, so we can't let you do that. Okay, so typically what happens, like anytime I have to do an undergraduate project with a student, I have to send the application for ethics approval, even if it is completely observational. Because in my head, it's completely confidential, anonymous, whatever they'll, you know, my students don't, but it takes a third person, a third body to actually look at it and say, yeah, you know, you are not going to be violating any confidential and privacy information here. Okay, so so there are situations where you have to put in the application to an ethics board when you're working through university or through a hospital or through long-term care research bodies. It just must, if you're part of that organization, just to avoid privacy issues, being sued. If you're going through, say, Laurentian University accepts money from the big funding government agencies. The Tri-Council, which is SHIRC, CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research, and NSERC, which is the National Science and Engineering Research Council. So these are three big bodies that govern all research funding in Canada. And they're three big councils, so that's what they call the Tri-Council. And the Tri-Council has an ethics statement, a big document. It's called TCPS, Tri-Council Policy Statement. I think it's the third edition now, so I think it's TCPS 3. So the TCPS 3 has, you know, a bunch of different guidelines, and if your university collects any money from this guy, and this guy, which all universities in Canada do, they have to abide by TCPS. Okay, TCPS has an online module that usually research students are required to take and pass, because when you typically do that module and you take the test after, you should have a pretty good idea of what's ethical, what's not, what takes ethical approval, so on and so forth. Okay, so universities will require, most institutions will require your research application to be sent to the board. Whether they'll require you to do something to ensure confidentiality or not, most of the times, if it is non-participant observation or you're not collecting any identifying data, they don't require you to do anything. They're just like, okay, go ahead, do it. The other way we collect information in the social sciences is we do a lot of interviewing. There are different kinds of interviews. Semi-structured.
Structured.
Thank you, structured. And you have mixed interviews, where you have both. Your semi-structured interviews typically will have a fixed bunch of questions. They are open-ended questions. They don't necessarily have a free-flowing form to them, in the sense, when you have, I have to say open interviews too. And your textbook only talks about structured and semi-structured. Anyway, so semi-structured are open-ended in the sense that you have, your interview probably has 5 questions, and you ask those questions to get to a certain objective. So the questions are framed a certain way, and you don't necessarily feed off of one question to go to the next. In an open interview, what happens is you perhaps start with just one question. And the one question leads to a bunch of different topics that you as an interviewer follow up on, and you don't really define what the end goal of the interview is. You start with the opening question, and the interview opens up lots of different areas, and after a certain period of time is done and the interview is done, you have the transcript, you go back and you identify the themes and so on. So that's probably the most open. What we typically see for interviews on television when politicians are interviewed or celebrities are interviewed tend to be of a semi-structured nature, because the host typically has an idea as to where they want to go with the interview. So they'll ask a question, there may or may not be a follow-up. So there's a guy on CBC, I think it's George Strombopoulos.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how you spell his name. If you YouTube George Strombopoulos' interviews, what you'll find is his semi-structured interviews are, there's very little follow-up on any of his questions. His interviews are very good, so you can see some of his shorter interviews. But what he does is he will ask a question open-ended, the person will answer it, and then he'll jump to a second question, which may or may not have anything to do with the previous question. So, but he does it skillfully, so you don't feel like it's all over the place. But if you have been listening to interviews for a long time, you can sense that he just asked Barack Obama about the Nobel Prize, and now he's asking about financial situation in the US, which has nothing to do with what he just asked, which is, anyway, so it's different. And then you have Peter Mansbridge, another CBC interview, and I'm just picking out names from CBC because hopefully some of you have heard some of these interviews. Peter Mansbridge also does semi-structured. He does open interviews as well. But even when he does semi-structured, there's usually a follow-up. It's more like an open interview than like a semi-structured interview. So he uses the interviewer's narrative to move through different areas. And he doesn't necessarily define where he wants to get to. So they're a little bit different. Structured interviews are probably the least rich of the interview types. And the reason is structured interviews are, you're asking a very specific closed-ended question. It's more like a questionnaire, more like a survey, and you get a response and you're done. A mixed interview type usually, and this is also used a lot by good interviewers, both in research and on television. A mixed interview type is you start with an open question, and then you have different pools of questions that you can choose from to follow up, okay? So different ways, but the idea is you get a lot of descriptive information, which leads to ideas and themes which can be used to construct a theory if you have a bunch of interviews. We also measure data using records. Records could be descriptive records. They could be statistical records, okay? So examples of descriptive records would be newspapers, numerical statistical records would be stuff that you can get from StatsCan or your city records. For example, you're looking at property values, you go to the city of Greater Sudbury, they send you down to the main library, and then there's a book, what's that book called? Oh boy, yeah. In Sudbury, it's called Vernon's Directory. So what Vernon's Directory does is Vernon's Directory, from the 1940s, it actually has records of each and every property being built, how it was zoned, and how many apartments it has. So for example, if you wanted to do some research on the number of apartments that have legally been converted into a duplex, say you're an investor, you want to buy a duplex property so you can rent it out, and you want to really not have to waste time going through a sales agent only to discover that the property you think is a duplex is not actually legal. So you go to the Vernon Directory and you look at statistical data for how many houses got converted in which year and what those houses are. So those are, you go through records. You can go through health records from your local district health unit. You can go through health records from Stats Canada. Descriptive would be newspapers, books, and journals. As an example is, if you wanted to look at ageist themes in the newspapers in Sudbury from the 70s until now, if you wanted to identify, for example, older adults being portrayed as mentally incompetent. That's your broad theme. And while I can't spell again, while you don't have to necessarily find the word mentally incompetent, there might be other things that are suggestive of exactly the same. Older adults are exceptionally vulnerable to
Cognitive impairment.
Well, that kind of stuff, or vulnerable to salesmen because they're gullible, they're trusting, different aspects that suggest that older adults are significantly different cognitively from everybody else, and as a demographic to talk about. So you could go look at newspapers where you have articles on older adults and see how they're represented from the 70s to now, and you might be able to have a little scale where you can check off on different boxes. At the end of it, you find, well, there weren't many articles on older adults, and every time there was an article, it was always about somebody getting hurt. It was always about somebody getting robbed or somebody getting mugged. And as we get into the 80s, that doesn't change much. They're portrayed more and more as being vulnerable, but somehow in the 2000s, we start seeing the empowerment of older adults. We see them as accomplishing different things. I don't know what you'd find, but I'm just saying so that's one way to do it. You can look at books as well. I think the example in your textbook is looking for books written for not young children, for tweens and adolescents, where the protagonist is predominantly male. So you look at all children's book written from the 60s until now, and you see, well, who's the hero of the book? Is it male? Is it female? And you start to, look at all of that.
Would personal journals or diaries be acceptable for research?
Absolutely, and it would be a case study. So that's a great question. So personal diaries. So Connie, can you tell me more as to what you're thinking?
I'm just thinking if you wanted to, I don't know, doing a qualitative study about a certain time period, and what it was like growing up during that time period in a certain area. And there were a couple examples of people who had personal journals. Could you go back and use that?
100%. Because what's going to happen is, regardless of who it is, writing style, writing fluency, themes are going to come up. you're going to see different themes depending on, their neighborhoods, depending on what they encountered. There are going to be overlapping themes, and there are going to be themes that are completely unique and different. Maybe one person grew up in a great neighborhood, maybe one person grew up in a neighborhood that was full of crime, violence, maybe one person had access. So you might see a lot of interesting observations. And any of these, the data that you get out of personal diaries is some of it is going to be generalized because there's going to be a cohort experience, right? If they grew up around the same time, they're going to have experienced, let's say, I don't know, their parents going to the Korean War or the Vietnam War, if you're in the US. If
Sir,
you, yes.
with something like the Diary of Anne Frank, her recorded experience of the Holocaust. Remember Anne Frank, the little girl whose book they found?
Yeah, yeah. So if you look at Anne Frank's diaries, I mean, that provides a lot of rich information on her experiences of the Holocaust itself. And personal diaries are absolutely very much a way of reviewing written record. These days, I think by the time we do our research these days on younger people, it's all going to be blogs and tweets that we'll be researching.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also written record. I don't know how long tweets stay. Do tweets disappear or do they stay forever? Okay, so tweets are a very reliable because they don't go away. Which is the stuff that goes away? Snapchat. Marianne tells me Snapchat.
Yeah.
Snapchat. Unless you have a way to save a lot of Snapchat information, you can't use that to reliably research. But somebody. I mean, lots of people are already researching tweets right now because that's how people are communicating, and they're looking at communication patterns. But that's where it's headed. If you wanted to go into the past, it would be diaries. And if you wanted to go still further back into the past, maybe 400, 500 years ago, and if you weren't educated, then it would be oral histories. Or if you looked at our First Nations individuals, there's a lot of oral history. Anyway, so yeah.
Would you need to question the accuracy or the reliability about those?
Well, it depends. A lot of experiences are personal. So when it is personal data, the accuracy and the reliability are based on the individual alone. There is really no way to triangulate that data. So for example, my grandfather was a bonded laborer under the British. So he was enslaved by the British. And he basically had to work 18 hours a day till somehow he ran away and joined the military, which interestingly was also with the British, but they somehow didn't care that he had escaped servitude because he had joined the army, and it was World War II. So anyway, the point is, where was I going with this?
Validity in people's personal diaries.
Yeah. So so the accuracy. So my grandfather experienced a lot of pain and suffering, and he would explain how he'd be locked up for hours. If there was no work to do, he would just be locked up in a little tiny room for hours. And anyway, so the thing is, there's no way for me to prove that. Okay, there's no way for me to say if that is accurate data. So there is that issue, especially if, for very, very personal content. Some of the things can be verified. Was the tax system that the British imposed on colonial India, was that disproportionately unfair? Was it brutal? Yes, that can be verified. You can ask 10 people and they'll tell you, well, we all experienced this. We hardly had any money left after the British took away what they did, right? So there are things that are verifiable. There are things that are not verifiable. And there is a limitation. So when you do your research with these personal interviews, verbal histories, you have to state that as a limitation of the study itself. I don't know, Connie, does that help?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
No problem. So We measure data in all of these different ways. This is, I think I have a typo here. This is how data is primarily collected for, well, it can be quantitative if you're measuring the number of times a theme appears or the number of time a behavior appears. But the data can be qualitative or quantitative. So I would not just say that. Okay, it could be qualitative or for quantitative. The good thing about qualitative research is once you pick a variable, you can modify the measuring instrument as you start to collect the data. So for example, you're looking at suffering due to exceptional taxes during imperialism or colonialism, okay, on the natives. Your initial data might be, well, let's look at lack of money to buy food. Okay, but as you interview a couple of people, you realize that not everybody was starving, but people had difficulty paying their rent. People had difficulty having a reasonable amount of clothing to wear. People had difficulty sending their kids to school. So then you say, okay, the suffering due to taxes is not just starvation. It's also all of these other things. So now you're fine-tuning your instruments to measure other deficits caused due to excessive taxation. So it could be schooling, clothing, etc. Okay. So we talk more about observations. We spoke about very specifically. We have to specify what we observe. So like in the Tim Hortons experiment, everybody observed a different thing. After 15 minutes, I told the students, okay, stop. We all have great descriptions of what you observed. Now we're going to look for one and only one thing. We're going to look for people who arrive in, who are not singular, which means they arrive as twos or threes or fours. We're going to observe people who arrive together, and we're going to wait for one of those three people to look at their phone, and we're going to see how the other two respond. And the reason we're doing this is in order to prevent social awkwardness. If there are two people who are sitting, chatting, whatever, standing together in the line, and they're still talking, but one of them picks up a phone, within a few seconds, the prediction is the other person will either pick up the phone or look around or not know what to do with themselves. Okay, that was the prediction. So students are observing for this behavior. And interestingly, we got a lot of relevant data from that observation because everybody knew exactly what they were looking for. Okay, so one person was looking at the people waiting in line, one person was looking at a couple of tables in the back, one person was looking at the tables in the front, one person was just looking at people in the hallway heading to Tim Hortons. If you haven't been to Laurentian, Tim Hortons is inside this building, and there's a massive, massive hallway leading from the great room where food is served all the way to the Tim Hortons. Okay, so people had lots of different observation points, and they could look for exactly what they wanted to see. Same thing with illegal driving. If I just have students taking observations at different street lights, and I just tell them, well, why don't you look for bad driving behavior? I haven't defined anything. They won't know what they're looking for, and data is going to be all over the place. If I just simply say, look for people that break a red light, that's simple. So you can collect data easily. Okay, so if you specify what's to be collected, it's always easy. You don't want to save data in your head. You're going to forget, you're going to mess up, you're going to make a mistake, and there's no way for anyone to verify, because remember, science has to be transparent. People have to see the process. It's a process. Everybody has to be able to come to the same conclusions as you do. So that's why you have data collection sheets, which can be nothing but a sheet of paper that you've drawn a big box. And if you're thinking about traffic light violations, maybe on you label on a sheet, this is entry to Laurentian. That's the traffic light you're at. And maybe this is, let's say Monday. This is Tuesday. And let's just pick 3 days that you're collecting data, Wednesday. And then you can have a separate box, picking different times, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, and so on. And then you're starting to count traffic violations. Monday, you got 3, 10 to 11, you start seeing more. And 11 to 12, you just get the 1. Tuesday, it's a little bit different. Probably reflects class times or whatever it may be. Wednesday. So these are your rough data sheets, okay? So typically rough data sheets may look like this, they may look different, but you need data collection sheets. So once you have a whole bunch of data collection sheets, say I have 10 different traffic lights and I have 10 students at each of those lights. Each of those students will end up giving me one of these sheets. So let's say this came from Samantha. We might have a different one come from Jesse. Jesse may offer me a different sheet. Sorry, my pen won't work. There we go. Then we may get a different one from Connie and so on. So then we have all of these data sheets and then we start to put the numbers together and so on. So you need data collection sheets even when you do observations. When you compile, when you collect all the numbers from the data sheets, those next set of sheets are called data summarization forms. Now your textbook has examples of all of this. So you'll see what a data sheet looks like. A data sheet might have a very rudimentary form of just noting down numbers. Your summarization form is a little more complex in the sense that you actually have physical numbers that you can see. So you might also decide to use an observation checklist for ageist behavior or sexist behavior. And an example of this is in your textbook where they're looking at a family discussion and seeing if there is a general sexist tendency in the family depending on whether the speaker is a male or a female. So they have an observation checklist. Oops, sorry. For each conversation that starts off at the dinner table. So they write the topic of the conversation. And let's say they talk about new store. The next topic is what happened recently. What's the big football thing that happens?
Super Bowl.
Super Bowl. Thank you. Jeez. So I'm not a big football person, if you can't tell already.
I like soccer. It's okay.
Yeah. Super Bowl. And then Super Bowl has a halftime show, right? So the halftime show at the Super Bowl. So then you start writing who initiated this topic. So maybe Tom initiated this topic. And then you have different things you're looking for. How long did this, did the conversation continue beyond 2 minutes? Okay. So Tom starts this conversation. It goes on for beyond 2 minutes. Did other people discuss? Did others participate? You can decide different variables and you go check, check, check. And we're talking about the Super Bowl, maybe John brings it up. Again, it's something that's discussed. And the halftime, you see Jenny bring up to talk about the halftime show, and you see that, well, that's shut down right away. Nobody cares about the halftime show. Who sees the halftime show? It's all about the football, So you see that the women are getting shut down. So you can have an observation checklist where you are simply looking for different topics come up and whose conversations are being heard, who's being shut down, who's being mocked, ridiculed, and so on. Okay, so you can have an observation checklist to also identify different behaviors, different attitudes, and so on. You can have checklists for quantitative observation too. So a quantitative observation would be disruptive behaviors in the classroom, like we spoke about. So you have a checklist, and you can write down each disruptive behavior. So you can say, oh, sorry, pinch, oh, pinching, throwing stuff, giggling, playing with hair. Okay, and then what you can do is you can have a sheet per student, or you can have, if you're doing it per student, you need lots of observers. But if you're generally having 3 or 4 stuff, so you clarify a research objective saying, I'm looking for disruptive behaviors in the classroom. Okay, and you start noticing 3 or 4 behaviors that you're able to observe. You don't want to have 20 things thrown in there. So you can have a checklist where you look at different measures or different variables for disruptive behavior, and you start going, okay, I see a couple of these, I see only one of this, I saw one instance of this, playing with hair was quite common. And so you can have a checklist both for qualitative and for quantitative work. You have to define what the variables are. Like we defined the variables for responsive behaviors in long-term care, we defined the behaviors for, say, disruptive behaviors in the class. It's a good idea to define them ahead of time so you know what you're looking for. Sometimes you may go into a situation where you might encounter a disruptive behavior that you never thought could occur. You might need to add it on the spot. Typically, you should have predicted all of these as much as possible. Sometimes it's not. And then how are you going to study each of these disruptive behaviors? Are you going to count the number of times it occurs? Are you going to also determine how long each behavior occurs? Great, she was playing with her hair during class. She was clearly distracted. There was one incidence of this. Well, Joanne was playing with her hair for 10 seconds for the entire class. But Juliet was playing with her hair for a minute every 5 times. So is the duration important? How are you going to define each variable? You have to be very clear. How will you record your observation? So, well, you have your data collection sheets, and you can record for incidents of something occurring. You can also record for duration it occurs. You might be able to do both. And then once you have a checklist, before you actually start collecting data, use that checklist as a practice, because if you get a behavior that's not on your checklist, now you can add that to your checklist before actually collecting observations. So that's why you practice. Of course, then you have to report your findings at some point, because now you've collected your data. So that is in phase 2. Phase 1 is formulating the research question, formulating measures of instruments, finding variables. You remember all the 5 steps for phase 1, right? Researchable question, deciding, instruments of measure, deciding the variables, choosing a sample. All of those things are part of phase 1, right? So you report your findings after you collect your data. So collection of data and organizing your data, analyzing your data, that's all part of phase 2. We'll talk about it. This is a YouTube exercise of watching a classroom in action. I'm going to post the slide. You can look at it yourself, because I'm not quite sure if this will work from here. I'm going to try, but it may not work. Let's see. So if it doesn't work, don't worry about it. You folks can watch it at your own time. It's just a classroom exercise looking for disruptive behavior, as far as I remember. Well, we'll give it a try, though. video is not available anymore. Well, never mind. We will stop a little bit early today. We'll go through the questions next class. Now, on Monday, for those of you who aren't in Sudbury, there is well, it's all over Ontario. There are a lot of school strikes going on, as you're aware. So for Monday's class, what I'm going to do is I have childcare only until 11:30, and it takes me about 20 minutes to get home. So Monday's lecture is not going to be super long. We'll finish by about 11:05. I'll try to wrap up by 11:05, so I have enough time to go meet my babysitter and get my son. Okay, so we will start sharp at 10 like we do every time, but we will finish a few minutes early so that I have enough time to get back home and make sure everything's okay. All right.
Okay.
Other than that, I have time for the next few minutes. Did you folks have any questions about what we covered today, or any questions regarding the course in general, midterms anxiety, pretty much anything relevant? If you don't have any, that's fine too. You're more than welcome to leave and enjoy yourselves. Have a good weekend, and we will see you on Monday.
I'm organizing some stuff, so I will email you, and then we can set up a meeting.
Yes, different course.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. You're welcome.
Okay. So have a nice weekend.
Thanks.
See you Monday.
See you Monday.
Bye.
Bye.